Hello, welcome. So glad to see everybody here. Really, really excited for this conversation with Ryan Coe, a good friend, a board member, a phenomenal leader in the space, to talk about the civic tech landscape in general. Before I pass it over to him, a couple of notes. We do have a Q&A function here in this chat space. I imagine that many of you have never used this particular chat platform before, but if you look at the bottom, you should see a little button that says Q&A. And if you click on that, you should be able to add in questions. There's also, of course, the chat where you can just type in chats. I see a couple of people already greeting in the chat there. Would love for folks to type in where you are dialing in from. Always good to know where the spread of folks are. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. Please feel free to add in questions in either the Q&A or in the chat. If it's in the Q&A form, then I'll do my best to make sure that Ryan sees it at the right time. And otherwise, here for a bit of an informal conversation. I'm really grateful to everybody for joining. And Ryan, I'm happy to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks everybody for joining. I have to be honest, when Mark and I first came up with the idea for this, it was about a month ago, and we were just thinking about what could be an interesting topic for an informal Friday hangout with people who are interested in technologists for the public good. And this was one of the topics that came up, and we were like, well, yeah, maybe 15 people would show up and just jam on a Friday afternoon, kind of like a informal, Friday afternoon kind of a conversation. So, there's going to be a lot more than 10 to 15 people. So thank you to everybody who's joined. I'm sorry it may not have the small group vibe that we were intending for, but I will do my best to try to get to everybody's questions and things like that. So there's no slides. This really was meant to be a very casual kind of a conversation. But I do have probably 20 to 30 minutes worth of content that I'd like to try to get through, and then we could get into questions. Although if you have questions in the chat, we'll be reading them as well and may address them either during or after the little spiel that I have. Before getting started, though, I would love to understand who all is joining so that I could try to cater the material to what you all would find most helpful. So, and admittedly, we're using this platform for the first time, or at least I am, as in this role. But I would love to understand. Maybe we can use this little hand raise button and then lower, just to do a quick poll of who's here. So, and bear with me, it'll be a little clunky, but if you don't mind raising your hand, if you would consider yourself as you would define it, early career. Is that
I'll make a question. Do folks see a hand icon down in their screens? Well, we're doing it live, so we'll find out. We do. Hey, look at that. Okay.
Okay, cool. All right.
Great.
So cool. So is it all right? So maybe lower your hands, and then would you consider yourself mid-career? Just in general. Okay, what about more senior, mid-senior, director level, executive level? Okay, couple more. Okay. And of the folks here, who is interested, who's here to learn more about the field in general? And who's here more with specific career transitions in mind? like breaking into civic tech or switching jobs? Okay, cool. So a bit of all of the above, which is good to hear. And I think this is kind of what we were anticipating. And so for that reason, we're probably going to keep the conversation fairly high level, but we can definitely note details and comments in specific situations. But yeah, if it was like all students or like all senior folks, then this would be a different conversation. So I'm glad glad to understand the 30 some odd folks who are here. Please feel free to use the chat. I'll definitely make sure to read while we go. So again, thanks everybody for joining and sharing a little bit about yourself and kind of what brings you to this conversation. The reason why Mark and I decided to do this event was largely because I've had probably a couple dozen of these conversations one-on-one already through people who reach out to me and ask, hey, Ryan, like I work in XYZ. I'm not sure what Civic Tech is. You seem to have been there for a while. What is it? Why would you work there? What are the different pieces, etc. So over the course of lots and lots of these little casual one-on-ones, I've kind of had quite a few of these conversations and thought it would be good to try to scale that a little bit. But it's still very messy and not for publication or anything like that. So by way of introduction, sorry, seeing an internet connection unstable thing here. So please do let me know if I start cutting out.
I'll give you a note if you do. So far, you're fine.
Thank you. Sounds good. I'm Ryan Coe. I use he, him pronouns. I would consider myself probably like mid-ish career, maybe a little more than that. But I have been in the civic tech space for the better part of more than a decade at this point. I'm a computer scientist by training and professionally very much a change maker and a consultant. I currently work as a freelance consultant supporting governments, nonprofits, and the occasional private sector institution here and there on product, tech, IT, procurement, finance, strategy, operations, just all sorts of things. But I worked at Code for America for 4 years as the chief of staff. And prior to that was an IT consultant at a large consulting firm, McKinsey & Company, where I worked with governments on large IT projects. So that kind of, and I spent a bit of time in the political organizing space as well, worked on a couple of various political campaigns here and there as well. So that background kind of informs my worldview here, right, about civic tech. And the caveats for today's conversation are this is just my perspective. It's heavily oversimplified. There's a lot of nuance that we won't be able to get into and a lot of different ways to map this space. So please consider this just one humble civic tech practitioner's view and definitely not the only way of looking at things and cutting this up. So as we get into this conversation, there are a couple of things that I would pose to you as you listen and perhaps absorb my content here. The first is, what is your theory of change? What is the change you want to be in this world? The reason I say that is because many in civic tech have different angles to the work that they're doing. Some angles are issue specific, or what I might term a vertical. For example, you may come to this space because you care particularly about climate change, or poverty, or gender equality, or racial equity. You may come to this space with a specific issue in mind, right? You may come with a specific topic that you care about changing, and that's kind of what brings you to the technology, civic tech, public interest tech ecosystem. You may also have a horizontal in mind. You may come because you care particularly about talent or finance or procurement, or within even technology disciplines, you may care more about product or data science and analytics or AI. So I guess what I would ask you is like, what's your orientation and your theory of change of what you want to do and to help? Because as I go through the view of the world, your angle may inform which parts of this are relevant to you. I briefly broached into skill set, but that's a different part of this as well, which is like, what do you bring to the table? What's your unique thing that you would contribute to the space, to organizations, etc.? And this may be a taboo topic, but how much money do you need or want to make is always a topic that does come up when we talk about this, right? It's hard to ignore that people perhaps with more privilege or more wealth may have more flexibility to take lower paying positions, right? So worth acknowledging, always an awkward topic, not fun to discuss, but people who have student loans may have different financial constraints than people who don't, for example. So just a topic to consider. And I thought these would be like interesting framing questions to ask before I get into what I consider the civic and public interest tech world to be. I'm going to pause. I see a couple of comments and I want to make sure to read them before moving on. Loving the comments like regarding change, the old model of meeting centric, working with mission driven people, clear and easily accessible government services for all, especially those in underserved, overlooked populations, right? These are all great reasons for being in this space. Great changes we want to see, theories of change, etc. Specifically, why getting into UX, love it. Experience, yeah, exactly. I love this, like the actual experience of working within public libraries and ed tech, etc. Like, love it. And I see more folks filtering in as well, not just focused on the revenue, skills. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. Please do continue to filter, or please do continue to contribute if you'd like, but I will move on. So with that, and I wish I had like a fun graphic to share. I don't yet because it changes all the time, but in general, the way I view the public interest in like tech landscape when it comes to like job searching tends to be through three main sectors, right? And it's nothing surprising here. There's like the public sector, so that's the government. There's the private sector, so that's profit-seeking companies. And then there's nonprofit, the social sector, so to speak, right? Academics, philanthropic funders, change-making organizations, etc. So let's talk about those one at a time. Let's start with the government, and let's start with the public sector. So there's lots of ways, of course, to cut the government. Like you could kind of take it by layer of federalism, right? You could do federal, state, local, special district, et cetera, et cetera. There's a very kind of clear way of thinking about the government at that level. But perhaps more interesting to the people in this room might be the framing of how one might become a civic technologist in government. And where I'm going with this is that, to me, the most important way to cut government is to think of it as traditional IT versus the more digital services orientation that we in this room may be more familiar with. And the reason I explain it this way is because while our email inboxes and Slack channels and community boards and messages may have much more, and our bookshelves and the PDFs we download to read may be much more in the civic tech digital services space. The vast majority of government still operates in the status quo where technology is viewed as IT, information technology. And that might be an antiquated view, which I think most of us agree with. But in the status quo view of the world, technology has a department, the IT department. I actually have a couple of current government clients who still operate in this traditional, old school, so to speak, view of the world. And in this view, program departments or the program or the business or the administrators, whatever they may be called, dictate what they want and technology implements it. So an IT department is oftentimes responsible for everything from like tech support, answering tickets, password resets. Hey, I have a court hearing I need to administer, but the appellee can't make it in person. So can we try to do this via Zoom or Teams or something? Like pure tech support, all the way to what we might consider service delivery. Like, hey, it's the middle of the pandemic and we have to build a website to do like a custom delivery of pandemic food stamps for children who used to get free lunches in school but now have to get them remotely because schools are not operating in person during the pandemic, right? And so all of that in the traditional view of government falls under IT and is led by people whose title tend to be CIO. While that is the world, that is, sorry, let me back up a second. That is a world where technology is oftentimes viewed as projects, not products. Technology is viewed in the same way that you might build a bridge or a highway or a transit system, where you go and you buy something. You go and buy technology, procure it largely from like general contractor vendors, such as an Accenture or a Deloitte. And that's kind of the status quo. And while this world, the civic technology, the public interest technology, digital services oriented view of the world, the product centric, design centric, user and human focused view of the world has evolved a lot and grown a lot, the vast majority of government is still largely, there's a technology department called IT. Maybe it's called information services, led by a CIO. And I think that's a big takeaway and something I want to push, because I want to explain that that's still largely the world that we are trying to seek to change oftentimes. That is a world where job titles sound like IT analyst and IT specialist and IT associate and IT program manager and things like that. You're not going to find a lot of product manager or service designer or UX researcher or data scientist or DevOps engineer in that view of the world. But that is still the world that we live in, and the world that I think this entire broader movement of civic tech, public interest tech change makers are trying to build more of, right? Because that's certainly not the view of the world. That's certainly not the view of the world of many of us. And that's certainly not how technology is done in the private sector, at least anymore in the current world where things are much more product focused, user focused, etc. So I've spent a lot of time on that specific point, but the big bucket of government where the most jobs are is this traditional IT bucket. The quote unquote newer school of thinking is what we might call digital services teams. And there are many variants of this, but the world that most of us are familiar with or know of, because these people publish and talk about their work, generally is considered digital services. So some of the more famous examples of this would be like the US Digital Service, which started in 2013, 2014, when the old school IT view of the world built the original healthcare.gov. It didn't go so well, right? It was procured like a project to a bunch of contractors and subcontractors. It wasn't very user or human focused. And so one of the original digital services views of the world was the United States Digital Service, which views the world, in terms of like a tour of duty kind of a view. It was set up in a way where, because change makers weren't really able to like get into the and break and change the traditional IT departments, right? Kind of what John's putting in the chat right now. It was kind of viewed as a bit of an outsider, but in a consultative like support kind of a way. So many federal agencies, many states, many cities have digital services teams. And when you see the phrase digital services, I hope you will think of this dichotomy between the like traditional technology department versus the newer school sort of thinking. But I hope you will also remember that the digital services teams are oftentimes struggling to change the status quo, and oftentimes do not sit within that IT department, and sometimes may have smaller budgets and maybe special priorities of certain political appointees or various agendas, as opposed to like the big honking thing that's been there and that we're all trying to evolve and change. So I think it's an important reminder, because I think many of us got into this space because we heard somebody talk, or we saw something on social, or somebody came to our company or our university or something like that. Yep. I view, John, to your point, I view innovation very similar to digital services, although there are even further nuances, because sometimes the innovation team can often be like a special projects team that has a much smaller budget than the big IT department that is, doing the thing, right? So, but I hope these distinctions and nuances are helpful. Like, the jobs that you might be more excited in applying to are probably all in the digital services and innovation places. But where the rubber often meets the road, sometimes, right? Again, there's a lot of nuance I didn't get into, but sometimes, unfortunately, the big decisions are still made by the like IT and technology department. So I bring all of this up because I think that's an interesting distinction and hopefully a useful framing as you look at government jobs. Now, there are a lot of government organizations that don't fit cleanly into this like dichotomy, right? There are, frankly, like change-making organizations within government. So, for example, there are organizations that are trying to design like they're trying to also shift government to more of that digital services view. So I'm thinking like all of the folks at TTS, Technology Transformation Services within GSA, they're not really a digital services team themselves. They're also not like traditional IT, but they ship things like login.gov or cloud.gov, where they're trying to productize and to like build shared services in a new product oriented, like more DevOpsy way to help government be better, right? So I hope that helps when you look at a government job and you go, why do all the jobs on USA.gov or USA Jobs like look or like the, I don't know, state of whatever, wherever you're located, like the state of Ohio's IT website look like they're all like IT Specialist 3. And then you look at like, I don't know, New York Digital Services, and you're like, well, how come they have product managers, but the state of California's IT department doesn't? I hope that this explanation of this dichotomy helps. Or if you come across like a really interesting like innovation role and you go, where does this sit in government? I hope that this framing helps you do some research to figure out like, is it actually within the decision maker, or is it like, oh, the governor really cares about innovation and so they set up a new innovation team, but it's 6 people in the state capitol with no actual like influence. But you'll write some really cool white papers and change the way people think about things. So that's kind of one big chunk is government. And I just want to stress the point of this like old school IT versus more human-centered, user-centric, design-oriented, product-centric, best practice, like modern technology delivery best practices way of thinking about this view. And to Riley's point, that's a big one. There are many people in government who have to hack around their system. So you will see roles that are like exactly like Riley's example, like data analyst 3 parentheses data scientist, right? Who are trying to do that. And I also want to acknowledge the tension that oftentimes arises between this kind of dichotomy of the world. And again, I painted it as a picture of two extremes. In reality, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of gray area in between. But I think sometimes, especially the like traditional government IT view will be very resentful because they'll think like, oh, I've been in public service for 10 years. How dare you come in from the private sector and you view it as like, oh, you're going to like innovate your way. Like, what are you talking about? There's a separate innovation office. Like, we've been innovating here for 18 years. Like, what? And honestly, I sympathize with both views of it. I just want to point out that that's kind of unfortunately, when you have to draw a spectrum from traditional IT to like digital services and the way we want to make the change, there are people all throughout that spectrum. And it's kind of I just want to acknowledge that potential for like tension because it's not always that simple. It's like, yes, like we do want to disrupt the IT core, but like just because the state of New Jersey has an innovation office doesn't mean the people inside the IT department at the Department of Transportation in New Jersey don't innovate, right? So I think that's worth calling out. I feel like I've been on both ends of that conversation many times. So that's government. Let me pause here before I move on to private sector and nonprofit. Mark, are there any questions you think I should get into right now based on this?
There is one question in the Q&A section here that I'll highlight real quick. Question is, how do you negotiate differing attitudes towards innovation in the civic tech space? Basically, how do we form relationships with existing departments and structures and encourage them to adopt design thinking and product thinking?
IVN, this is a great question. And a question that if I had the perfect answer to, I would have had a lot more impact in the world. I love this question because I think the answer, and unfortunately the answer with nuance is it depends. Without going into a ton of detail, my general note would be to figure out where the power lies in that organization. And I use that word quite intentionally, where the power lies, where the authority is. Every government system I've ever had the privilege of encountering has a different power structure somewhere in the complexity. And it's really interesting to tell like where it is, because that's where you're going to have to change minds. It also differs heavily based on the type of government. And oftentimes whether or not there's a degree of urgency, like a burning platform to evacuate off of, or like some kind of urgency that drives the situation. It can be very hard, especially because sometimes the power is very distributed. As to be clear, it was designed to be in the United States, right? Our government is set up in a way where power is very distributed. But what that means is that a state CIO might actually read a paper about design thinking and go, this is awesome. I can't do this because I have no engineers on my staff, so I don't actually get to build any technology. I have a budget where I go buy from vendors, but I have to make my requirements very rigid and not agile because I have to approve $20 million of spending at a time. I can't approve 200K at a time. So in that case, it's not just the CIO whose mind needs to be changed. It's also the procurement department or the finance department or right. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I love this question. And that's actually a big, it depends is really the answer. I think in some states, it really is just like the mayor said this, or excuse me, in some cities, it's just like the mayor said this and the city manager agrees and therefore it shall be done. And I think you'll find in places like that they've gotten a little bit further along than in other cities where there's very rigid procurement rules or there's very rigid finance rules. Like funding must be allocated 1 year at a time in exactly 365-day increments and not more and not less. Right? That makes it very hard to do like product-oriented thinking where you're working in cycles of 2-week sprints or where requirements change because you get 6 months in and then it sounds like, well, actually, we thought the users wanted this, but they actually want that. That's in some governments very difficult to do, right? So I love the question. I think it actually raises more it raises more questions than answers, but it is indeed a natural continuation of what I've raised. I'm going to move on just in the interest of time. The hour is flying by. I'm shocked I'm able to just keep talking this long, but I hope this is helpful. Please let me know if it is not. But I'm going to move on to private sector because I think that is another big chunk and where a lot of people have impact. The private sector is obviously profit seeking, but there are heavy degrees of differences across, right? So I think the part that we're probably all the most familiar with, just because of we live in a capitalistic market-based society that is largely driven by big companies, is big tech, right? So there's many different versions of this. There's like IT providers who sell technology products like Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services and things like that, or like industry agnostic solutions like, I don't know, Oracle or SAP sell big ERP systems. And then there's like also tech that sells software that aims to help government do things, right? So for example, companies like Tyler Technologies do a lot of like court and correctional and system justice oriented products. You know, a Palantir might do like data pieces, etc. But like in general, I kind of lump this all into like big companies that deliver technology and tend to not be like systems change or social impact oriented, right? It's much more like maximize shareholder value. Now they all say there's a mission and an impact, which sure makes sense and probably is correct, like technically correct, but just I lump it all kind of in different branches of big tech. I would also consider the big vendors who deliver government contracts like Accenture, Deloitte, IBM, Cognosante, et cetera, all to be in that big tech category as well. Different flavors, right? They're not going to government and saying like, please buy a bajillion instances of my cloud container, this and that. They're like, hey, we will, you know, we see that you need to build a new tax system. We would like to build it for you for the low price of $40 million or whatever, right? But like, I view those are more like general contractors to me, as opposed to like offering a solution or having a thing to sell. But I lump that all in big tech. And I think within all of that, that's where a lot of jobs are. That's where a lot of money is. That is a place where there definitely is impact. But it is not a place one goes to, at least not in my view, to be the most high leverage change maker. It's a little more incremental of like doing something in the status quo a little bit better, things like that. There's of course plenty of small startups in the space, people who are building different ways to do all sorts of things, right? Oh, sorry. Within the big tech bucket, it's also worth mentioning like government specific tech. So there are companies who only sell technology to governments. And I'm shocked that I'm blanking on it, but I'm thinking about there's a company that does like constituent outreach, like they do all the text messages. Oh, Granicus is the company I'm thinking about. So that's an example. Like Granicus is a company that sells software that does like text messaging, emails, meeting facilitation, etc. for governments, right? And so like they're an example of what I would consider maybe not like a big tech company, but like they're owned by a private equity firm. So like to me, they are a profit-seeking company that is focused on maximizing shareholder value in that way. But they sell government-specific solutions. And then there's a lot of small startups in this space. Yeah, to John's point, actually, most counties are. And then there's, so in that way, they are a big tech company, even though their profit and revenue numbers are maybe 5% of what Google's or Amazon's or whatever might be, maybe even less. Then there's a lot of small startups in this space. I won't go into any specific details, but there's a ton of small startups in this space, right? And some of them come at it from like a specific angle, like, hey, what if we designed a safety net application that anybody could use across states and like navigate SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid across states. And it's not replacing the government system, it's just getting them to the front door, but it might be a cool navigator app. And what if we made money by selling their data? Right? So without naming that company, that's what they do. They're a fairly successful New York-based startup that focused, or formerly New York-based? I don't even know, but I'm not going to name the company, but like that's what they do. They're an interesting startup. They're trying to innovate in the space. There's lots and lots of small startups. But I also wanted to spend a bit of time on a different category of not just big tech versus small startup. I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what I consider a relatively new advancement in this field over the last 5 to 10 years. And that is the concept of a digital services firm. You may have heard of some of these firms before, but this is a burgeoning sub-industry that is growing, and I love that it is growing. What a digital services firm is it tends to be a professional services or technology firm that bids on and wins government contracts, competing against the large general contractors like Deloitte or Accenture, but largely with a much more like human-centered social impact view. So organizations that I consider in this space, and there are many of them, but organizations that I would consider in this space would include, the bigger ones would be like NAVA, Public Benefits Corporation, Ad Hoc, right? Exegy, etc. And so what I'm putting in the chat is like, this used to be a much smaller group of companies. It used to just be a few companies that started from like the alums who came out of like the US Digital Service, etc. But now I think if you actually like look at the like member organizations of the Digital Services Collaborative, you're going to find something like 50 different organizations. And Mark, did I even put the right thing in the chat? I'm not even sure if I did.
Yep, it's there, and yeah, that works.
Right. Okay, cool. So they like changed the website or something, so I'm like, I can't find the like, oh, here we go. Yeah.
It's under the story
so the like list of members is not on the membership tab. It's actually on the like story tab. But you're going to find like almost 50 or 60 different groups of organizations of all different sizes, some of which are like 500-600 people and some which are like 2 or 3. But they all generally ascribe to like this digital services playbook that they mentioned, which are the like non-status quo IT version of the world, and try their best to be both change makers, but also profit-seeking organizations. right? And many of the smaller ones have certifications such as women-owned, veteran-owned, small business, certified small business, etc., which allows them a little bit of preferential status to like help compete against the big organizations. And to me, working at a digital services organization, like a firm like one of the ones in these links, is a really interesting way of like having a blend of like, well, I still work in the private sector and therefore I'm free of some of the government constraints while also still seeking to like do good change making in in government. So I wanted to bring that up because it's definitely another valid path compared to both big tech and like very small startups or like starting your own company. And this is generally, I consider this a field that didn't exist 10 years ago. Very much is a relatively new thing. I'm sure it existed in different ways, but it definitely had less of a name and a label and like an entity around it 10 or 15 years ago. And I just, I had a lot of people ask me like what these organizations were when people seek to break in from, say, big tech or something like that. So I thought it would be interesting to explain. And some of these organizations are more product oriented, like they build their own products, but most of them are truly services oriented, where they're like trying to be better government contractors for government and like build things in better ways. I actually encourage you to look through. I think there's a lot of cool stuff there. Okay. So I did a whole spiel on government and then paused, and now I've done a whole like mini spiel on private sector. Let me pause again. I don't see any new Q&A, but is there anything, are there any questions on the private sector piece?
I'll just remind folks that you can add questions both in the regular chat as well as the Q&A specific feature.
I'm just going to keep going. We're somehow already 45 minutes in, which I'm shocked by. Then there's also nonprofit, which is much more, I think, what I would consider basically not government or not private sector, right? So there's various organizations with various theories of change that are focused on changing something about the system. Some of them might take a more talent-oriented approach and are focused on like training up and bringing technologists into government. A couple examples of that include, for example, the Tech Talent Project, or Mark's former employer, the Partnership for Public Service, right, which is focused on fostering like and developing public servants on topics such as digital. There are other organizations that all have slightly different orientations to this. So, for example, the U.S. Digital Response was formed during COVID as a way to organize volunteers. There are organizations like Code for America, which in its current iteration is effectively focused on a couple of different verticals: safety net, tax benefits, and criminal justice, and bringing all of this change into those spaces, as well as continuing to build and foster the community. There are other organizations that are focused on like different specific slices of this, but I just wanted to give a few examples of like nonprofits of different sizes. There are also more academic organizations. So a couple of examples might be think tanks like New America, that has certain research labs such as the New Practice Lab, or the Digital Infrastructure and Governance Initiative, DIGI, they also have a public interest tech university network, etc. Like that's a think tank, right, with many digital services or like public interest tech oriented arms. Another example might be academic labs within institutions. So a couple that come to mind might be the Beck Center for Social, I think it's Impact and Innovation, if I remember, the Beck Center, BEECK, at Georgetown. Or there are a couple of groups at Harvard, such as the Government Performance Lab, which focuses on more procurement, but there's a digital arm. or like it used to be called GovX at Hopkins, but I think it's like evolved into the like Bloomberg Center for Cities or something at Johns Hopkins. There's a big group that does some really cool work there. They did a ton of like COVID data viz, for example. And then there's like the Belfer Center at Harvard. There's like a lot of different groups that do really interesting work, but that's more academic. It's more like research oriented. And sometimes you'll find things like a nonprofit that is hosted within a university as well and stuff like that. And then just like there's venture capitalists and funders within the private sector, there are, of course, funders in this space too. And that would be the philanthropic institutions, such as the Gates Foundation, the Bloomberg Philanthropies, et cetera, things to that, right? So there's like a big nonprofit kind of an ecosystem there, many of which are very, very interesting. I went through nonprofit fairly quickly, but I want to zoom out a little bit right now and say I've now talked about the three big chunks of what I generally consider the public interest or civic tech world. There's, well, the system itself, so government, then there's private sector, and then there's the like social sector, so nonprofit, academics, philanthropic, et cetera, et cetera. And I will pause again just to see if there are other questions at the moment.
We've got some folks sharing their personal experiences about organizations that they're joining and resources as well, which is always great. If folks have other resources that they want to share, please feel free to drop them in the chat here, and we can always share those out with the rest of the community.
I have a couple of other observations perhaps to close with. I know I've been talking for a while. When moving from the private sector to civic tech, as with really moving from any industry to another industry or any space to another space, just remember how, the language and the context that you use switches, right? So there's always a little bit of code switching that's involved, and just keep that in mind. Like when you think about public sector, you're generally not, like, it is not generally a profit seeking, or profit is not the primary motivation, and therefore you may be used to, in the private sector context, an A/B test where like user acquisition matters a lot. In government, you probably will and should consider other contexts, such as not just growing a pure number of paid subscribers or something like that, and making sure that like actually the people signing up for a service are actually representative of like the constituency, or like, tracking that you're actually getting a good mix of urban versus rural, or various populations, or gender balance, or whatever it is. Just know that government has a slightly different purpose, right? So if you're coming from big tech, right, like remember that your company has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders to maximize their profit and their stock price. And when you go to government, it's like, remember that there is no fiduciary responsibility. It is rather the social contract between a government and its people, right? Which is a very, very different topic. So I think like that's an interesting piece to add. And again, most of what I've said today is kind of stuff that is kind of fed into Ryan Code GPT from dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of these conversations over the years. I have not done a good job of writing it down or documenting it. So thanks for kind of hearing it in its current form. But like an example that I found very useful to read was the Tech Talent Project has kind of like a hiring playbook, which is interesting to read because it does go into some of these differences between private and public sector and things to think through. It's written for a specific audience, but I do hope that most people will find something interesting in there. And then to answer a couple of questions from Tommy, can I talk about my current consulting? Sure. The thing to know perhaps is that I'm currently freelancing. I have my own LLC, and the purpose of doing it is largely as a mini sabbatical after serving as a chief of staff of Code for America for 4 years. I felt like I needed to explore what my own next angle into all of this is. I myself do not know. I've considered public service. I've considered working at a digital services firm, working in big tech, or going back into nonprofit, right, which is where I came from. And the consulting, I'm now about a year and a half in. I've been very lucky to have enough clients to make it financially sustainable. I don't think it's a long-term thing for me. I imagine 3 to 5 years from now, I'm back at a full-time role, likely in one of the things that I have just talked about. But I consider it a sabbatical for now. But I will say I am appreciating doing it. And I will say that consulting by yourself in a like self-employed way has lots of pros and lots of cons, right? I don't have a boss. It's great. I'm my own boss. But if you've heard this phrase in sales before, you eat what you kill, right? You only make money when you sell a project and deliver the project. There's no stable salary waiting for you. There's no paycheck at the end of every month. It's just what you can sell and deliver. So I think there are pros and cons to the self-employed thing. And I wish I could tell you exactly what I do. I have to be honest, I don't really do a thing. I do lots of different things based on what my clients ask of me. So for example, I coach a nonprofit chief of staff. I mentioned earlier, I support the CIO of a small California agency who is trying very hard to be product-centric and user-centric, but has lots of constraints placed upon him by the state and regulatory agencies and the legislative policy world he's in, and spend a lot of time working on supporting him. I actually work for one of the think tanks that I mentioned earlier, and help them with research and policy. So I wish I don't really have like a specific specialty. I'm kind of just working on projects that people are willing to do. I will joke that oftentimes I find that most of my clients are like leadership who spend a lot of their times in meetings, who don't have enough time to like think and do the substantive content work. And that's how I felt at Code for America a lot. As the chief of staff, I felt like I sat in a lot of meetings and I didn't really have time to like I'd often think to myself, oh, if I just had 15 hours a week to like do a project, I would come up with this great thing and it would be awesome. And in fact, in one of those moments, I actually hired Mark at the time as a consultant to do my 15 hours a week of thinking for me. And this was 5 years ago at this point, and now Mark has a full-time job and has actually referred somebody reaching out to him about consulting to me, who I took on as a client. So anyway, Tommy, I hope that helps explain a little bit more. And then with regards to Allison's question here, what qualifications government are looking for? I think it's interest is a big one. Obviously the like professional experience and skill set and all of that matters. I think if I'm being really honest, there are also some kind of, there's like patience with government hiring processes is another one. There are lots of things that somebody might have to like do in order to get through all of the things it takes to get a government job, right? So there's a lot of requirements and things like that, and we could talk about that in a whole nother thing. But I think like Allison's correct that like the obvious ones are like interest in the mission and the work. But I will also say that more than interest, oftentimes, as somebody who's hired people at Code for America, and this is kind of the chicken and the egg thing. Like, you want people who've demonstrated that interest, not just the interest, but like that they've done something to show it, right? And I will say that, and I'll pick on my former employer, McKinsey, for a while, because every once in a while somebody will go, "Hey Ryan, I'm interested in doing public sector nonprofit work. I'm tired of like the evil corporators work that I used to do at McKinsey. I want to like do some good in the world. And hey, Ryan, can we talk?" And when that conversation starts, "Ryan, tell me what Code for America is," that's a really bad sign. Because they could have Googled, they could have spent 15 minutes reading what Code for America was, or like signed up for a TPG event and listened to this talk and thought about it for a second before asking me, right? And so like when these resumes come in and they like, and Allison, to your point, if it shows the interest and it shows like, "Oh, by the way, here's my GitHub of a thing I hacked together when I went to this Alliance for Civic Technologists hack night," or like, "Oh, by the way, I read these 2 papers and wrote a blog post about like what I think about them," or whatever, or like, "Here's a draft policy memo I wrote that matters here," or like, "Here's a wireframe that I sketched up with," like whatever it is, like it's not just interest, but it's demonstrating that interest will help. It will go a long way in helping establish credibility and trust, right? Because if you're in this meeting, if you're in this room, you are not the person who's like, I just want to, I worked at Goldman Sachs for 10 years. Now I want to change. I want to do some good. Like, you've got to take it 1 or 2 more steps past that, if you know what I mean. So I think that's how I would answer, Allison, your question about that. Is to just kind of show a little bit. And granted, it's not like it's easy, right? It's like that joke that like every job requires 5 years of experience. So how can you get your first job if you don't have 5 years of experience? It's a little bit like that, but there are ways to do it without having worked in the field, just to demonstrate interest, right? Showing up at things like this, etc. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? No, it's 3 o'clock on the East Coast and lunchtime here on the West Coast.
I think I haven't seen anything else come in yet, and I know that we are at time at this point. Anything you want to close with, Ryan?
The only thing that I would say is I hope that you have enjoyed using the Technologists for Public Good community platform here. We recently switched over to it, led by the work that Mark and, of course, Riley, the executive director, have been doing. And if you're interested, if you're already a member, please do continue to come to these events and contribute in the posts and discussions. And if you're not a member, please do consider becoming a member, because we'd like to be able to provide these events and do more. And I find it, I'm really enjoying reading the chat and meeting new people. And I encourage folks to reach out to Mark and to Riley, and please don't be shy about reaching out to me. I'll put my like LinkedIn in the chat or something. Or actually, you know what? I won't put my LinkedIn. Message me on the TPG community platform instead.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ryan. Folks, if you have any other follow-up questions or comments, feel free to send them to Ryan, to myself. If you go back to the event as well, there's a little sort of section where you can add comments and such, and you can add things in there. We're always pulling together more events. We have regular community check-ins where people can come and just chat. We have recorded this session. We're going to go ahead and post it up at some point in the new year. And otherwise, just thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us. And Ryan, thank you for all of the wisdom that you've shared with this community.